a routine flight, a sunny day, and happy passengers until disaster struck. Just 20 minutes after takeoff, a deafening explosion ripped through the cabin, and in an instant, the roof of the plane was gone. Passengers were left gasping for air, exposed to the open sky at 24,000 feet. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. Hello, friends. This is the unbelievable true story of Aloha Airlines. Flight 243. On the 28th of April, 1988, around 1 p.m. in Hawaii, the Aloha Airlines Flight 243 was about to take off. It was a beautiful day, a sunny day, and most of the passengers were there to enjoy their holidays. In case you don't know about Hawaii, it is a group of islands in the Pacific Ocean and is a part of America. They are beautiful islands, and their capital is Honolulu. This flight was actually traveling from Hilo to Honolulu. Hilo is the southernmost island of Hawaii. It wasn't a huge distance, it was a 35-minute flight, a routine flight. The Aloha Airlines is a local Hawaiian airline, which connects the various islands. Because of the short distances, this specific plane had already flown 8 times since morning. It had gone on 3 different round trips. But this wasn't unusual. It's normal for such planes. Everything was going as it should. Passengers board, the doors were closed, and at exactly 1:25 p.m., the flight took off. There was one unusual thing, though. When one of the passengers was boarding the plane, before entering the door, she saw that the riveted sheets that make the body of the plane, one of those sheets had a little crack. But she didn't tell anyone about it, thinking that it won't make a difference. Since this was a reputable airline, and the plane used to fly regularly, assuming that it was inspected regularly, and that someone would have noticed if there were any problems. She, though, that it was inconsequential. But no one could have imagined how devastating this was going to be. Only after 10 to 15 minutes of the plane's takeoff, the air hostesses brought in the trolleys and started serving drinks to the passengers. The seatbelt sign wasn't turned off yet, because it is usually turned off only when the plane reaches cruising altitude. And for this plane, the cruising altitude was 24,000 feet. There were 3 air hostesses on the flight, serving drinks to the passengers. And just 20 minutes after the takeoff, the flight reached its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. And as soon as it reached this height, there was a big blast. The passengers heard a loud bang, and there was a sudden rapid decompression. People have trouble breathing. Things went flying all around. Total chaos and terrible confusion. No one could understand what was happening. Some passengers looked around and saw that the plane's roof and surrounding walls were missing. They could see the sky above them. What happened was that about 35 square meters of the front of the plane's body had disintegrated and blown away. What usually happens is that the air is always pressurized in cabins in a plane, so that we can breathe normally. Otherwise, at a height of 24,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure is very low. The air is so thin that we cannot breathe normally at that height. That is why aeroplanes have their own pressurization system which regulates the air by pumping it. If for some reason the system breaks down and the aeroplane keeps flying at the same altitude, then, in case of this emergency, those oxygen masks will drop down. You must have heard about this in the safety briefings. In the event of loss of cabin pressure, oxygen masks will drop. These oxygen masks typically contain an oxygen supply for about 15 to 20 minutes, during which time the pilot has to get the plane to descend to an altitude where people can breathe normally, at a height below 10,000 feet. Now, in our story, what happened? In Flight 243 is that the oxygen masks did drop, but the oxygen mask system was not working. Due to the plane's roof being blown away, the oxygen mask system was completely destroyed. People were concerned about hypoxia, the condition in which if your body does not get sufficient oxygen, you can get unconscious and eventually lose your life. Within seconds, people started feeling dizzy and confused. In such cases, it takes only 1 to 2 minutes to lose consciousness. Michelle Honda, an air hostess, was near row 15 during the explosion. She tried contacting the cockpit through the intercom, but there was no response from the other side. The second air hostess, C.B. Lansing, was serving a drink to a passenger near row 5. When the roof of the plane blew apart, she went flying out of the plane. Their third colleague, Jane Sato, was near row 2. She fell to the floor after being hit by a flying luggage. There was commotion all around. When Michelle didn't get any answer from the pilots, she went to each and every passenger to ask if they knew how to fly a plane. This scared the passengers further. They were being asked to fly the plane. This made them wonder about the pilots. Without trained pilots, they were doomed to crash. She reached near the cockpit by crawling on the floor. There, she saw her colleague Jane's head was bleeding. When she tried to look inside the cockpit, she couldn't see anything. The cockpit's view was completely blocked. There were only a few precious minutes after which all of them would lose consciousness and DE. But apart from hypoxia, these passengers had to bear strong winds. Winds as fast as nearly 500 kilometers per hour speed were blowing at them. It was difficult to keep their eyes open, and the temperature was at minus 45 degrees Celsius at this height. Even if there was oxygen supply somehow, it wasn't possible to survive long in that cold, because most of the passengers were wearing shorts and t-shirts. Hawaii is a tropical place where people go to see beaches and jungles. There is no snow here, so no passenger was prepared for this temperature. Michelle was the only air hostess in her senses. She kept trying to contact the pilots. "Can anyone hear me?" But there was no answer. Among all these dangers, the good news was that the pilots were actually alive. And not just alive, the pilots were in much better condition than the passengers. Their oxygen masks were thankfully working. 44-year-old Captain Robert Schomsheimer was in command, a highly experienced pilot working for Aloha Airlines for 11 years. With him was the 36-year-old First Officer, Mimi Tompkins. When the explosion happened, both of them felt the shock, and when they turned around to see, they saw that the plane's roof was missing, as well as the cockpit door. There was debris all around, but both of them immediately got to work. First of all, they wore their oxygen masks, and considering the situation, they decided to go for an emergency descend. They flew the plane at the speed for 500 kilometers per hour and descended at a speed of 4,100 feet per minute. But the time constraint wasn't only for the descent of the plane. They had to face another problem, bigger than this. It was found that due to this incident, the nose of the plane, the front part in which they were sitting, was drooping down a bit, only by about 1 meter. The floor of the plane was the only thing holding the cockpit and cabin together. If they kept flying so for a long time, the two parts might break apart. Mimi Tompkins contacted Honolulu and informed them about their situation. They were told to land the plane in Maui instead of Honolulu since it was closer. At 1:48 p.m., she contacted Maui Tower and informed them about the situation. It was about 3 minutes since the plane's roof had flown away. But thankfully, the plane was at 14,000 feet. At this height, it wasn't difficult for most passengers to breathe. And since it had descended within 3 minutes, most people didn't lose their consciousness, and at least the risk of hypoxia was over. Mimi Tompkins contacted Maui Airport and told them to keep all emergency services ready. Anything could happen. Firefighters and rescue vehicles were at standby on the runway. Everyone was waiting for this plane to land. A minute later, the plane had reached the height of 10,000 feet. When another problem arose, there was a 10,000-foot mountain in front of them, the Haleakala Summit. This mountain was between the plane and Maui Airport. Captain Roberts slowed down the plane. 210 knots, 200 knots, 170 knots. They keep slowing down. They fly it as slowly as possible. Any slower and it would be difficult to control the flight. Maintaining this speed of 170 knots, they navigate the plane between two islands. The plane evades the mountain and turns towards the airport. At this point, the passengers could understand the situation better. They finally realized that the plane was flown by a pilot. Not only was the pilot alive, but he was flying the plane expertly. As the plane went towards the runway, Mimi Tompkins deployed the landing gear. There should be 3 sets of wheels, 2 on the rear and 1 on the front. The ones at the rear are called the main gear. The indicator showed that the main gear was successfully released. But the nose gear The wheels at the front weren't releasing properly. Now, technically speaking, it is possible to land without the front wheels, the nose gear. This is known as belly landing, and it is done during emergency cases. But in this specific case, where the middle portion of the plane was so weak and the roof was already missing, the pilots were afraid to attempt a belly landing because then the plane would crash definitely. And if something happened to the fuel tank, there could even be a blast. This airplane, and the condition it was in, because it didn't have a nose gear, because when the nose touched down on the runway, it would have broken the airplane apart, therefore, breaking probably the fuel tanks apart, which could lead to a very dramatic fire and explosion. But there was no other option, there was nothing else they could do. The pilots decided to attempt landing like that. As soon as the runway was visible, the passengers were holding on for the landing. Some started praying. Others were hugging the people around them. This could very well be the last time they saw each other. Most of the passengers were still terribly scared, all for a justified reason. As the plane descended, it had started moving side to side. The pilots realized that their left engine had failed. They tried to manually restart the engine, but unfortunately they couldn't restart it. By this time, the emergency services were prepared on the runway. Firefighters, ambulances, and evacuation teams, everyone was preparing for the worst situation. At 1:56 p.m., the pilots informed the Maui Tower that they will need all the equipment the airport had. Meanwhile, a person on the runway was tracking the plane with binoculars. That's when he spotted that the nose gear was successfully released. The plane didn't need belly landing. They informed the pilots. One less thing for the pilots to worry about. Then, at 1:58 p.m., exactly 13 minutes and 42 seconds after the explosion, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 touched down on the runway. Apart from using the brakes, the captains used the thrust reverser of the remaining engine. Gradually, the plane came to a halt safely. The emergency teams present on the runway breathed a sign of relief. The passengers were de-boarded from the plane through the emergency exit. The passengers applauded the captain and thanked him for saving their lives. Although most of them were safe, many of them were seriously injured. An 84-year-old female passenger who was sitting on seat 5A had a skull fracture and suffered the most injuries. The passenger sitting in 6A suffered a broken hand. The passengers in 4A and 4F were seriously injured. Basically, most of the passengers in rows 4 to 7 were seriously injured because the roof of this area had blown apart, and the passengers in rows 8 to 21 were only minorly injured. Apart from this, there were 21 passengers who weren't injured at all. Air hostess Jane Sato remained unconscious. She suffered only a concussion. Air hostess Michelle Honda was safe, and after landing, she counted the number of passengers to check whether any of them were missing. And it turned out that miraculously, everyone was safe and alive, except for one. 58-year-old air hostess C.B. Lansing was the only one who passed away in this incident. Search teams tried to find her later, but unfortunately, her body couldn't be found. She disappeared into the depths of the sea forever, and the remaining 94 people were grateful to have survived. Was it mere luck that they survived? Number. The credit goes to the technical equipment. I am talking about the seat belts, the biggest reason why so many people could survive. As I told you in the beginning, because this flight hadn't reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign was still on and people were wearing their seatbelts. Had the people sitting in rows 4 to 8 hadn't worn their seatbelts, they too would have flown out of the plane. After this incident, as this news spread, the photos of this plane were published in newspapers globally. A miracle flight without a roof. After this, America's National Transportation Safety Board sent a team of investigators to investigate this incident, to find the cause of this incident. The investigation team found that this plane had completed 89,680 flight cycles and 35,496 flight hours. The fuselage of this plane, the main body of the plane, was weakened due to fatigue and corrosion. Every time the plane was in the air, the metal sheets on it expanded due to the pressurized cabin, and when it was on the ground, the fuselage contracted. This constant cycle of expansion and contraction made it weak. This was a Boeing 737 plane, whose fuselage is made of aluminum sheet metal panels arranged circumferentially in a frame. Each panel overlaps each other by 3 inches, and the overlapping area is called the lap joint. Because the thickness of these sheets was only 1 millimeter, Boeing developed a bonding process to allow the skin to absorb stress like a single unit. The company used a strong glue called epoxy to join the different parts of the plane. When this glue dried, a strong bond developed to distribute the stress in all the plates and to prevent any cracks. Glue wasn't the only way to keep these sheets together. In addition to the strong bond of glue, there were 3 rows of rivets on every overlap. The overlapping parts of every sheet was riveted together so that the entire frame of the aeroplane could be secured. Boeing's first batch of 737 aeroplanes used this method to join the sheets. But later on, problems arose due to using this method. They found that when the moisture content in the air was high, the bonds became weaker. The epoxy glue started degrading and the metal started corroding. This meant that the stress on these sheets were borne by the rivets instead of the glue. Because of this problem in 1972, Boeing decided to use a new method of attaching these sheets together. They started using hot bonding. It uses heat and pressure to attach 2 sheets together. Friends, interestingly, this hot bonding system was already being used since 1972, and the Aloha Airlines Flight 243 incident happened 16 years later. So, this airline was blamed for still using the old aeroplane. Boeing had issued a service bulletin in 1972 stating the issue with their planes and possible problems it may cause. In fact, in 1987, 1 year before this incident, Boeing issued an alert service bulletin that their older planes should be inspected and repaired properly in case any airline was still using them. Apart from this, Boeing had a safety design stating that in case of a tear in the fuselage, it needed to be limited to a 10-inch by 10-inch square. They had placed tear straps at every 25 centimeters of the plane's body, so that even if any part of the plane's body tore, the tear wouldn't spread to the rest of the body. But the Flight 243's condition was so terrible that there were numerous cracks across it. So many cracks that these tear straps weren't really useful. The NTSB said that when this flight reached its cruising altitude, the pressure exerted reached its peak, because of which the individual cracks came together and the entire section of the roof blew apart. NTSB's final report listed 3 main reasons for this incident. First, the management of Aloha Airlines did supervise the maintenance program properly and did not assess the inspections and quality controls properly. Secondly, they blamed the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration to some extent for not requiring a thorough inspection of the joints while issuing the Airworthiness Directive, whereas Boeing had recommended this. However, the FAA had definitely told Aloha Airlines to use a new testing method to find cracks in the plane's body, the eddy currents technique. In it, electric current is passed through metal to detect even the smallest of cracks which aren't even visible to human eyes. Aloha Airlines claimed that they did use this technique to find cracks, but they were later found to be lying. They didn't inspected their planes properly. Third, when it was discovered that there were problems with the old bonding technique, both Boeing and FAA took these issues lightly. Boeing had designed its 737 plane to fly for 20 years, with a set time limit at 51,000 flight hours and 75,000 cycles. Even though the total flight hours of Flight 243 was lower than this plane was used for short-distance flights. Because of this, its flight cycle count was at 90,000, whereas Boeing had recommended a service life of only 75,000 cycles. The plane was near the end of its 20-year life, which was another reason for this incident. A positive outcome of this incident was that all of Boeing's older aeroplanes were inspected again. And what did they find? Many of them had cracks, similar to the cracks in Flight 243. This proved that this problem wasn't limited to this plane. Other planes of this fleet had the same problem. Another positive outcome was that, ever since this incident, safety regulations are made stricter all over the world to prevent such accidents from happening ever again. In 1991, the Federal Aviation Authority launched its Aging Aircraft Safety Program. As per this program, all old aircraft will need to undergo mandatory inspections and control programs. After this, the techniques used in aircraft maintenance to detect cracks have also been changed forever. Using eddy current, ultrasonic testing, methods that don't rely on human eyes, are now used to detect such cracks early on. New rules were made for high-cycle planes. Like the Aloha Airlines flights, there are other short-duration trips where the planes have to complete as many as 10 to 20 flights a day. They are now required to be inspected more frequently. The American government passed a new law, the Aviation Safety Research Act, 1988, to better understand and plan for the structures and issues of aging aircraft. Overall, this one incident, friends, changed the aviation safety standards forever. Because of this, thankfully, since then, an incident of this level hasn't occurred again. While there have been so many improvements in the world of science and tech, there are still some people who fail to apply even the basic concepts. The terrifying tale of Flight 243 proves that even in the face of disaster, survival is possible. If you love gripping real-life aviation stories, make sure to subscribe for more, like if you were on the edge of your seat, and share to let others experience this incredible story. See you in the next flight. Safe travels.